I'd just like to start with you, Anthony, and ask you, generally speaking, what do you believe are some of the barriers to entry into the world of politics, government, and public service for minority groups? And generally speaking, how can those barriers be overcome?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to be on the panel. And it's not a simple question because if you look of where populations live, the demographics shift based on the demographics of the areas. I mean, whether it's Republican, Democrat, we know that coastal California has, got D's and inland has R's. We know that Southern California and certain parts of Los Angeles County are extremely diverse, and in certain parts of Los Angeles County, they're not. And so the hard part is when you look at the country as a whole, the statistics don't tell the whole story. Now, generally speaking, yes. Do we have a need to have a greater representation? Absolutely. But we also have to look at where the demographic situations are actually increasing diverse representation and where they're holding diverse representation back. And I think that's the bigger challenge, is in areas where the demographics are not as diverse, do we want to make sure that there are opportunities in those areas to have diverse representation? And of course, I think the answer would be yes. We all know that having different perspectives helps. So what are the barriers in that situation? Obviously, we've seen statistically that folks who are able to raise resources, generally speaking, have a better chance of winning. In particular, if you look around the country, men raise more money than women statistically, and that is one of the barriers to diversity. I think the same is true in minority versus non-minority communities, where you have a greater access to campaign workers, where you have greater access to campaign staff, we have greater access to capital, you're going to see diversity increase. And certainly on the local level as well. If you look in communities that have a large minority population, you're going to see a city council that's populated by minorities. If you see a community that doesn't, it's how do you help those folks who are underrepresented have access to the resources to get elected, the education opportunities, and all of the demographic issues work in concert to provide those opportunities.
And for Brandon and Chris, our two students on the panel, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about the general public and why maybe there are barriers to entry, but also just combine it with your student experience here at USC. Talk about the student groups or other student organizations where you've seen minority students participate or not participate.
I don't think this is a problem that's unique to politics. I think that, if you enter a classroom at USC, you'll notice that certain groups are underrepresented. If you go into a corporate boardroom, you'll notice the same thing. And I think that it's about, I think that there are times we like to believe we're more of a meritocracy than we actually are in a lot of ways. And it's kind of like what Anthony said, people that get elected to office are people that have resources, know the right people, that are in the right places, that have the right connections. And in terms of getting elected and being in politics, I think that that's something that is a less diverse group, and that there are fewer minorities who are in those positions. So that's what we see when we look at who not only runs for office, but who's able to win elected office.
And I think that, I'm just gonna take the political side of this. I think there's two main barriers to minorities getting involved at the elected level in politics. First of all, I think demographics do matter, like Mr. Portantino was saying. The problem is, even like in California, for example, where we have an 11% Asian American population, you don't have a proportional amount of elected officials at the state or federal level. Part of the problem is because of the way Asian Americans settle, we don't have congressional districts or legislature districts that have majority Asians or majority Latino districts are more prevalent. But so the first part is trying to find a way of getting minorities to settle in concentrated areas that allow legislative districts to be drawn up in a way that allows for minority representation. Secondly, I think that it's difficult for minority groups to coalesce around an established political identity. For example, amongst Asian Americans, only roughly a third of them, 36%, believe in a shared linked fate, or in other words, they believe that, or they don't believe, the majority of them don't believe that they have a cohesive political identity through which they can advocate certain issues. So yeah, I think those are the two big problems with getting minorities involved.
So I guess moving off a little bit of the subject that was touched on how diverse or concentrated communities elect more diverse officials, in 2050 it is projected that whites will be a minority in America. So maybe, Kerstyn, you want to take this one first, but it's kind of a general question. How will in America, where whites are a minority, look different than today?
I think that it'll definitely look different. What we've seen in California is that we have a lot more Latino elected officials than we do in other parts of the country, probably in large part because we have more Latino people in the state. The same can be true we have a larger percentage of African Americans. There's more diversity here. But I do think that if we're just relying on demographics alone in order to solve the problem of representation, we might find that solution lacking, just because I think that a lot of it has to do with who knows who and who's in what position. And the same way we're 50% female, but we have one woman on the city council and there are a few women in Congress, it suggests that demographics alone and numbers aren't the only thing and aren't really the solution to solving for underrepresentation.
I could touch on that. I think Kerstyn's 100% correct. I mean, demographics only get you part of the way. It's opportunity. And if you look at whether it's the achievement gap in the 3rd grade or the percentage of students that go to the University of California or the percentage of students that go into public service, we as a society are not making sure that the game is fair from kindergarten. And I think that's a responsibility that we have to do better. And obviously part of it is the economic pressures or traditional economic situations, as Kerstyn touched upon, knowing the right people. But if we make sure that all 3rd graders have a good education, that's going to translate to better opportunities when those 3rd graders are graduating from high school. And then if we make sure that that high school graduate has a spot at a university, it's going to make, it has a positive ripple effect. And, I'm happy that we're having this conversation because a lot of people shy away from the whole global conversation of, demographics or influences. I mean, in life, when you did your resumes, you put down associations to things that you thought were going to help you, right? You didn't put down associations to things that you didn't think were going to help you. I mean, we're a society that looks at resume as well as we look at everything else. And so we have to do a better job of making sure that the resumes tell a picture of a successful person regardless of the race, especially in 2050. Was that your date, 2050?
Follow-up question for you, Anthony, to speak to your time when you were an assemblyman in the California State Assembly, that you chaired a committee on higher education. You mentioned the import of primary school education, but of course higher education is a big role in that also. How do you believe Hispanic populations in particular and other minorities in higher education generally, and their access to higher education, how do you feel that that's influenced by the fact that they are minorities here in California?
Well, I think there's a couple issues. Obviously, I just heard last night, how many kids in this room filled out their FAFSA? One? Only one of you filled out a FAFSA, which is the federal financial aid form. I think we only about 60% of high school students fill out that form. Now that is the entree into higher education to fill out that form, and yet we only have 60% of our students filling it out. We have an inordinate number of community college students who fill out the BOG fee waiver form but don't fill out their FAFSA. So part of that is you have a large percentage of students who are the first in their family to be going to college. If you come from a family where your parents went to college, they know how to navigate the system. If you're an immigrant family where you're potentially the first in your family to go to college, you're at a disadvantage with having that local mentorship right in your kitchen. Then you look at California, we're last in the nation of counselor to students in high school. Some students have some high schools have 1,000 students to one counselor. Now, how is a counselor going to counsel 1,000 students? They're not. And again, if you look at the proportion of students who are the first in their family to be going to college, they're going to depend on that counselor because at home they don't have somebody who's gone through the system. And so higher education, as we all know, in my day you went to a four-year university. Now everybody wants to know what your master's degree is in, right? It's something we need more of, but yet the barrier, in particular in California, is significant. University of California is not as diverse as the population, not even close. And that's the public university system. It shouldn't be that way. But yet all of those other issues work in concert to keep diversity out. And so I think talking about the statistic is the first step to then trying to solve the problem. But it really is a combination of multiple factors.
If I could add on. I think that the discussion on education is absolutely imperative, but specifically as it pertains to a development of civic efficacy, I'm going to take Asian Americans again. They do have a higher level of education than whites, Latinos, and African Americans, statistically speaking, but they have a lower rate of voting than all three of those other demographic groups. So a high rate of education does not necessarily translate into a higher degree of civic efficacy or involvement. And so I think that trying to develop that culture and trying to forge a political identity around minority groups is of equal paramount importance.
So our fourth panelist just joined us, so I'd like to go ahead and offer her an introduction as well. Sorry about the traffic outside. Just joining us is Suzette Martinez. She's the former vice chair of the California Republican National Hispanic Assembly. She currently serves as a public affairs specialist at Los Angeles Universal Preschool, and is a former district office manager for Congressman McKeon from Congressional District 26. So join me in welcoming Ms. Martinez. So we'd like to point a question to you as soon as you walk in the door here. Let me see one.
Yeah, oh, sorry. Do you need this back?
No, that's fine. So we've been talking a little bit about the barriers to entry for various racial groups here in California and nationally. We cited the statistic about the fact that in 2050, Caucasians are it's projected that we will be a minority in the nation, not just here in California. And so we wanted to just give you the opportunity to just generally speak about what you think are some of the most salient, relevant barriers to entry into the world of politics, government, and public service for people who are historically categorized as minorities.
In my district, or my assembly district, 36 Assembly District, it's interesting because minorities through a plurality already are the majority. I've been involved in Republican politics for about 7 or 8 years now. And throughout my time, when I first started going to Republican conventions, I knew a handful of other Latino Republicans, and we all knew each other. And over the course of these 7 or 8 years, I go to conventions and I go to Republican gatherings, and with my efforts with the Republican National Hispanic Assembly, which is, I'll say RNHA, because it's slips off the tongue much easier. I've noticed over the past, since we started, that one of the things that we addressed from the Republican perspective was that we needed to be more inclusive, not just look at minority outreach, Latino outreach, Asian outreach, but be more inclusive. I agree that when I first entered into politics, I've been a staffer, I'm now a candidate, there wasn't very many mentors for me, being a Latina and being a woman. Really, there are not, I was definitely in a male-dominated field. I've never seen that as a barrier, though, and I don't know if I'm just blind to it, but I'll roll with the punches in any group, in any crowd. What I have noticed is that the Republican Party, we've been hearing year after year that they need to be more inclusive. We've said this within our own party. What we're finding now is that Republicans in California have actually been doing that. 3 years ago, we created an organization called Grow Elect, And the objective of Grow Elect is to recruit, train, and fund Latino candidates to run for local office. So what we're seeing now is more and more Latinos coming to the Republican Party. We're seeing now this election cycle in the state assembly, we have a real possibility of going from 2 Republican Latinos in the Latino caucus to 7. So we're beyond the point where Latinos are included, they are a part of the Republican Party, and they're running as quality candidates for a state office, which says for the Republican Party that we've come a long way over the past couple decades.
So just a follow-up for you, Ms. Martinez. So it's projected that Latinos will soon become a plurality in California. And so how do you think the thinking on historically minority groups changes once they're no longer really a minority?
I don't think that it will change too much, just as we've seen over the decade with any group, whether it's a religious group or a cultural group, that there is so much diversity, there is so much culture, and that doesn't really die. On one side of my family has been in the United States for 100 years. My grandparents worked with Cesar Chavez in Kern County during the labor movement. And on my mom's side of the family, she's a first-generation immigrant. And whether I'm at, making tamales with my family that are Latino and have been here for 100 years, or making tamales with my family that are immigrants, we have the same issues, and those don't die over time.
If you could, again, I'll address this to Mr. Portantino. If you could speak to your time in the Assembly and talk about the power of caucuses. Ms. Martinez referenced a couple times the power of Hispanic caucuses. There are certainly other minority-based caucuses. Can you talk to the power and influence in ways they have been effective and maybe ways they have not been effective?
Well, I think in Sacramento, you have the Democratic caucus, you have the Republican caucus. Obviously, Sacramento's dominated by Democrats, so which caucus has more influence? The Democratic caucus. You have a significant Latino caucus, which every year puts forth an agenda. They're the largest caucus within the sub-caucus of the Democratic caucus, so they tend to have input on an agenda, and rightfully so. It's a democracy. You have more members, you have more influence. There's an Asian Pacific Islanders caucus as well, and there's a women's caucus as well, and you see certain agendas, certain issues that are put at the forefront. The Women's Caucus focuses a lot on healthcare issues, and so it's common practice if you're going to do a bill or something that deals with healthcare, you will talk to members of the Women's Caucus. It's a good thing to create allies. So I think in some respects, if you looked at the DREAM Act, which was championed successfully, I think that was an area where the Latino caucus was right to say if you're a Californian as defined by the Constitution, you should be able to have in-state tuition in California. And that shaped that, and it was very, very successful. If you look at certain Central Valley issues, you mentioned your connection to the Central Valley. A lot of representatives around the California have connections back to the Central Valley. So you see farm workers issues taking a forefront, safety, OSHA, those things. So I think it's important, we all bring to the table our own perspectives as we grew up, and obviously as those perspectives create more allies, you're going to see the agenda become more successful. And so I think the caucus system does work and is successful.
I completely agree that the Republican caucus is not as powerful or effective as the Democrat caucus. I think that what we have found, though, is there is an importance. I agree that there's an importance of realizing when you have a majority that the people have elected that majority, so it's only right that the fair share and say be established in the legislature. I think that what we're finding is that, especially over the past 2 years in my observation of what's going on in Sacramento, is there is a lot more As much as there's a lot more gridlock, there's actually, I feel like there's a lot more Republicans reaching out and working with Democrats more so because you have to. And I think that our intentions are all good, right? We want to do what's good for business, what's good for education, what's good for all communities, whether they're Latino, women, or whatnot. And I think that as the numbers may continue to change back and forth, it's just a reality of politics, that will continue.
Okay, so question for Brandon actually. So you worked with on Wendy Girl's campaign, and how did race or diversity in general play a role in that, do you think?
I worked in the South Central office on Crenshaw Boulevard, which is a predominantly African American community. And more than anything else, I think I learned that we tend to marginalize or categorize racial groups too much. So we think that, oh, African Americans care about African American issues, Latinos care about Latina issues, Asians care about Asian issues. But more often than not, when I was talking with constituents on the phone and when I was canvassing, they have the same concerns that any other person does. African Americans care about having their kids go to quality schools, they care about having good jobs, manageable tax rates and business regulations, the same things that most Americans care about. So it taught me not to be so narrow-minded in my scope of minority politics and distinguishing the different minority groups, I'd say.
If I could jump in. I think you're 100% correct. I mean, most people want their children to get a good education. They want to park their car in their driveway and know it's there when they wake up. They have hopes and dreams and aspirations. And I think you're 100% correct that we do a disservice when we pigeonhole people and we micro-target everything, because it's a lot simpler. People just want good things to happen for the right reasons, regardless of where they grew up or where they came from. And I think there's an element in politics that tends to try to polarize for political advantage. And I think that's where the people get it better than the leadership, because the leadership's looking for the poker chip and the folks just want to go to bed at night and get up in the morning. So I think you're right.
And just to totally agree here, if you look at the data on that, it doesn't matter what community you address or you ask questions, their top priorities are education, jobs, and opportunity. And those are things that are a part of the American dream, really, and we're all Americans.
So we're almost to the midpoint of the hour, which is the point where we turn it over to you all to ask questions to our audience. So I'll ask you to start thinking about questions you may want to ask any of our panelists in a few minutes. But before we get there, I'd like to turn the conversation a little bit more global and ask a couple of questions that, of course, encapsulate the field of politics, government, and public service. There's a subset of Americans that, after President Obama was elected in 2008, I saw a number of books being released, volumes being edited with the thought or the concentration that, we've elected an African-American president and now the problem's over. Racism doesn't exist, and of course, we've done this, we've made a statement to the rest of the world that we are a post-racial America. And that term began to have some credence in American population, post-racial America. Incidentally, we use it in politics, right? We're living in a post-partisan era, which some say is probably not achievable. So my question to the panel, and really for anyone who would like to contribute to this, is does language like that do us a service, or is it harmful? Is it, in other words, can we ever actually achieve that goal of being a post-racial America and therefore a post-racial governmental system, political system? Or is that defeatist? Should we, the debate that I hear a lot is post-racial versus, or colorblind versus color consciousness. Like the idea that you look at someone and factor in all the factors that you see, color, gender, life experiences, education. Is this achievable? Is this possible?
I think that it is. I go back to a memory that I had about 5 years ago when I was watching American Idol with my then 5-year-old niece, and there was a Latino and a African-American singing. And my dad said, I'm sorry I'm not being politically correct here, but that black girl can really sing. And my niece looks at him and she says, "Which one's the black girl?" And to me, my heart just was so overjoyed because it shows that our younger generations no longer see color. They're striving for opportunity. I think that we're at a point in our nation's history where we have overcome some large barriers. But at the same time, I think that we have to remember history and we have to respect history and know that we always have to be each other's keeper and pay attention so that things like that don't happen again.
You get two.
Awesome. I think I would disagree a little bit, and I guess I don't think it's a question of history. I think it's a question of what's going on in the status quo. A lot of time, just because we don't mention race doesn't mean we don't see it, or doesn't mean we're not thinking about it. I think it was last week or the week before, Congressman Paul Ryan got in trouble because he talked about lazy inner city males not getting jobs, and there was a lot about that. There was a lot of back and forth about whether it was racist, who we meant. But I think that we can all agree that sometimes we may not always say, a certain racial term, or consciously think about what race someone is, but it's definitely in the back of our minds a lot of times. I think that's true in politics as well. I think just because we have a black president doesn't mean that we've reached a point where we're not thinking about race. I think it means that when someone goes to Harvard and teaches at UChicago and speaks well, we don't think about race, but that most of the time, it's still something that we think about. It's still a problem that we have.
And I think we have to be careful. Any George Carlin fans in the crowd? George Carlin talked about the use of words to give the appearance of solving a problem, and he used, you all know post-traumatic stress disorder, right? Well, in World War I, they called it shell-shocked. In World War II, they called it battle fatigue. Now they call it post-traumatic stress disorder. And his theory was if we still called it shell-shocked, maybe we would be helping folks who suffered. But by giving it a fancy name, we give it an affliction and then we don't treat the problem. And I think that's part of the issue with saying we're in a post-racial or post-partisan society is we've given it a name, therefore it must be true. And if you look at the halls of justice, if you look at the prison population, if you look at the statistics based on somebody who's arrested for the same crime, inordinately the person of color is getting a stiffer sentence than the person who's not of color. I mean, there are certain inequities, and I think, yes, it's a tremendous thing to have President Obama in the White House, but it's not the end of racism in America. I mean, it just isn't. We wouldn't have young men of color being shot if it was for walking down the street. And so I think we can't fall into the trap, and at the same time we can't be cynical either. We also have to look at the positives, and we have to look at where we're making strides, but always recognize that there's a segment within our population that keeps racism alive, just as there's a segment in our population that is fighting it every day. And I think you're correct in that your generation and the next generation get it a lot better than past generations, but the pressures are still there, and we have to be careful in how we address it and how we don't use a term just to say it's done.
Okay, so now we're gonna turn the discussion over to a Q&A. So we'd ask you, when you ask your question, please stand up and say your name and major, and also direct your question to one of our panelists. And please just be polite. If you're asking someone you disagree with the question, don't be disagreeable. So any questions?
Come on. Who's George Carlin?
Who is George Carlin?
Google him tonight.
YouTube him.
Like I said before, that's an awesome question, I think. That conventional parameters like educational attainment don't necessarily correlate to high degrees of civic efficacy. If you just look at a few statistics, Asian Americans don't think in political terms at all. 36% don't think in political terms. 57% are either nonpartisan or apolitical. They don't vote in the same numbers that any other minority groups do. They don't contribute to campaigns. They don't do community organizing in the same way that other minority groups do. To be honest, I think it's such a huge question that I don't have the answer to, as a single answer as to why that's a problem. But I think that if you look at Hawaii, that's a great example of Asian American communities coming together and forming a distinct civic culture. Before 2012, all 4 members of Congress of Hawaii were Asian Americans, partly because of the large Japanese American group that's over there, but they also found certain issues that they were very passionate about, and they, especially after internment in World War II, they believed that they needed to coalesce in order to make sure their voices were heard. And so I think that traditionally in California, the Latino and African American groups have seen trouble to a large enough degree that they've had to coalesce together. Ms. Martinez, you were talking about the Cesar Chavez labor movement. I think that was a great instigator of bringing the Latino group together, Latino community together in a political sense. And so I think the Asian community has had a lack of a catalyst like that to bring them together.
I think that within the Republican Party, we're seeing more of that
Right.
organization.
Right.
With Michelle Steele, who is the highest ranking Republican Asian American Board of Equalization. And then we have a lot of amazing Republican candidates,
Right.
Ling Chang, Kim Young, I always flip them, so I'm sorry. So I think you're definitely seeing there are issues within the community, and they are now starting to organize. And I think we're seeing organizing more, and maybe it's just me, within a lot of different types of groups throughout California.
Any more questions?
Okay, so I'll ask another question if we don't have another question from the audience. Something that we've touched on, I think, throughout today and is probably widely accepted is, generally speaking, and this is of course a generalization, which is never a smart thing to do, minorities tend to trend towards the Democratic Party more so than the Republican Party. And you mentioned strides that are being made here in California. Caucuses are joining and they're developing rapidly. I'd say I'd ask this question to Anthony first, and then of course to maybe anyone who would like to contribute. Generally speaking, why is that? Why do minorities trend more Democratic?
Oh,
You got the easy one.
got the easy one. We're speaking in generalities. Remember, I am a politician. If you look at a lot of the rhetoric, if you look at a lot of the debate, there's a difference between the rhetoric and the debate on Fox and the rhetoric and the debate on MSNBC. There's a difference. One tends to be a little bit more welcoming, a little bit more accepting, a little bit more, I don't like the word tolerant. One recognizes that we're a salad bowl. And when you have your salad, you want the pepper to taste like a pepper and you want the tomato to taste like a tomato, right? You don't want them to taste like they're the same, because if you wanted them to taste like they were the same, you wouldn't put them in your salad, right? And one tends to want a more homogeneous world. And I think one is a little bit more respectful of differences. And I think if you come to this country from a different place, you're going to migrate to the place that is accepting and appreciative of your differences. And I think that is probably the biggest piece of it. And if you look, whether it's criminal justice or whether it's education, if you plug in the policy, where is the perspective that's appreciating differences and where is the perspective that is saying melting pot? And I think that's why people migrate there. Now, interestingly, if you look at the Reagan Democrat of the 1980s, those Democrats who became Republicans, many of them were ethnic. Because as they got a bigger piece of the middle class, as they've got to be suburban Democrats, economic policy started to shift their thinking and took precedence over social policy. And so they moved. I think that's one of the lessons that, you know, people may start down their political journey looking at social policy, and certainly one wouldn't argue that the Democratic side is a little bit more accepting of social differences. I mean, LGBT to racial issues. And so I think that's where, as people get more wealth, economics take a better or bigger piece of the discourse. But initially, it's social acceptance.
If I could.
I think I answered that. I think there was an answer in there.
As a minority conservative, of course I have to disagree. I think that Republicans do respect differences just as much as Democrats do, but I agree that the party has been, I don't know, borderline idiotic when it comes to how it messages it or markets itself. You know, in 2012, our flag bearer said things like self-deportation. When you hear, as a Latino immigrant, or as any immigrant, when you hear the term self-deportation, that's a huge turnoff, and it makes you feel incredibly marginalized. He said the things like, China is one of our largest geopolitical foes. That really turned the Chinese American community off. And so, I know I keep talking about Asian Americans, but it's the area I'm most informed in. 73% voted for Obama, which is a very interesting number when 57% don't even think in political terms at all. And so in exit polling, a lot of them said they voted for President Obama in 2012 because they were so turned off by the Republican Party. It was more of an against them as opposed to I'm for him. And so I think that the Republican Party is starting to get a little bit smarter in how it messages it or markets itself, and demonstrates to people that it is an inclusive party. It is a party that is for a diverse society, and it understands that America is a melting pot or a salad bowl. Yeah.
So I could probably talk about this topic for an hour. I think that if you look throughout American Latino history over the past 100 years, you'll see that their political positions have changed, have grown, have over the past 100 years. For instance, Nixon's presidency at the time, the Latino electorate was 7%, and 66% of eligible Latino voters voted for a Republican President Nixon. Now, looking at my family, I also understand, and in being raised in Southern California in a Latino family, my mom is a Democrat. Is anyone recording? Just kidding. My mom is a Democrat, and she is a Democrat because of Kennedy, of John F. Kennedy. She was born Catholic, her mom was Catholic, and for the first time for them during that era, they had someone that they could relate to, someone that represented their values, specifically religious values. Another thing I've learned about the Latino community is we're very, very, very loyal. So there is deep roots within the Latino electorate and the Democrat Party, especially in California, since the labor movement. I think, though, that policy that has been created and implemented over the past 30 years has kind of opened up this electorate's eyes to say, is the policy that's being adopted in California really for us? And we're seeing that Latinos, they may not be registering more and more Republican, but they're not registering as Democrats as much either. And I think it's because the issues within the Latino community and all communities are not being addressed: education, business, labor. So I would agree to disagree or not completely agree here that Latinos are automatically generalized to just sway towards the Democrat Party.
Let Chris go first.
I think I disagree a little bit with everyone. I guess I don't really think it's about rhetoric or as much about personalities as anyone would say. I think it's almost entirely about policy. I remember being in Sacramento a couple weeks ago and hearing from a Republican candidate for Congress. He talked about his outreach and like going to a black church and talking with them and like speaking their language and like not changing the policy, but changing the way he talked about it. And I think it was interesting to me. It was interesting to every other African-American person in the audience. We actually talked about it, that, you know, if he went to a small business meeting, he wouldn't say, I'm not gonna change my policies, I'm just gonna change the way I talk. We wouldn't say that at APAC or the Chamber of Commerce. And I think that when Republicans talk to different minority groups, they talk about changing the way they talk, but not about their policies. When I look at the Republican Party as an African-American, I look at a party that proposes policies that don't create economic opportunity in my neighborhoods, that create criminal justice policies that hurt people like me. And so I think it's a lot more about policy than rhetoric. And I think that if we dig down deep enough, we'd realize that minority groups aren't just children who don't know what policies are, that like we know what's good for us, we know what works, and that Republicans have been out of step for that with a lot of us.
And if I can jump on, I think you're amazing. And just pointing to some prominent Republican presidential candidates, and I think you're right in the sense that on the local level, things are different than on the national level. If you look at Mike Huckabee, when he was governor of Arkansas, he supported the DREAM Act. If you go on Google, he gave the best supportive speech on the DREAM Act of anybody has ever given. Then when he became a presidential candidate, guess what? He was against the DREAM Act. He had to, in order to, in his mind, to get elected. It wasn't about being true to his feelings. If you look at Mitt Romney when he was governor of Massachusetts, how many moderate positions did he then change when he became a presidential candidate? He wasn't true. How could you make a judgment at the end of the day of what he was truly for or against at a policy level if he was so willing to flip-flop from one office to another? And I think you're right. We have to drill down to the policy differences, but then also say, why do they change based on their ambitions? And so I think you're 100% right. It comes down to policy.
I agree, and I think it's comes down to policy, but I also think it's a little bit of politics, because you see that on both sides, whether it's the president changing his perspective of what marriage is, or Romney changing his perspective. It's all somewhat of political pandering quite a bit to get elected, especially in primaries, where you have to ignite passion within your base, because those are the people that are going to elect you. It's very hard as a candidate in certain areas, especially for me in a Republican area. I am Republican, but there are different spectrums of how people identify and what a party they identify with. And no one person, if I were to talk to each of you and you were to identify yourself as a Democrat or a Republican, I'm sure that your issues and your perspectives and policy would vary. So I think that it can be, for a Republican Party, I do understand that we've had way too many Republican politicians out there saying things and the camera shouldn't even be pointed on them. I don't agree with them. I'll call them idiots because that's what they are. You're in the limelight, you're running for elected office, and whether you are Republican, Democrat, Green Party, you have to realize that you represent everyone and you have to be considerate, articulate, and compassionate. And I think that that's something that the Republican Party has lacked a little bit, and just appearing to be compassionate. I think that there's a perspective out there that Republicans are compassionate. And I'll speak for you right here, I'm a very compassionate person.
If I could add just one thing really briefly without getting too tangential. I think part of this discussion is that we're talking about how big of a problem the primary system is. And I think that if you look at the base of the Republican Party, minorities are not a part of that base. Who's going to go turn out in the Iowa caucuses for the GOP, or the New Hampshire primary, or the South Carolina primary? The Democrats had this problem starting, I think, in 1956, all the way through 60, 64, really all the way up to Bill Clinton. They pushed their candidates consistently to the left, into positions that were not cohesive with the general electorate. And so to bring it back to race politics and minority politics, I think a huge problem that the Republican Party faces right now is that minorities are not part of their base. And so they've marginalized minorities a lot during the primary season. And a lot of those marginalizing terms that Mitt Romney used or John McCain used or George Bush used came during primary season when they had to put themselves to the right of their biggest competitors. George Bush had to move to the right of John McCain had to move to the right of Mitt Romney had to move to the right of, I don't know, Rick Santorum or whoever. Right? So there's a discussion of the
Scary
base.
thought.
Right.
And just to add to it, to go back to what the California Republican Party is not like the National Republican Party, because our issues here are different than any other state. But I'll go back to what the California Republican Party has been doing, again with Grow Elect, the ability to recruit, train Hispanics to run for office. What we've also found is if you do, if 47% of all local electeds, whether water board, city council, whatnot, are Republicans. So I think that Republicans are doing a great job, incognito at the moment, of actually reaching out to different communities and finding, reaching, cultivating leaders from within those communities that represent the values of that community. So what we're seeing more and more in Republican candidates in California is that I can be me, I can be Suzette Martinez, I can be a Republican, and I support immigration reform. I think we have a humanitarian crisis going on at our border that has to be dealt with. And we're finding that in California, Republicans from all backgrounds can be true to their issue, especially in for instance, the special election that we won for Andy Vidak up in the Central Valley. He was pro-DREAM Act. Why? Because that is what is important to his community. He is a rancher that speaks to his community, that speaks Spanish to his community, represents the values of his community. So I think that there's a lot of growth, and you're going to see that in the next coming years with a lot more diverse faces that are in leadership positions within the Republican Party in California.
Let's turn it back from questions from our audience. Yes.
My name is Ashlyn Byerly. I'm a senior. I'm a poli-sci major. And is that it? I'm a student.
Thank you.
I was actually wondering for anyone can really respond. It's more towards the Republican side of it, but obviously you guys are not old white guys, is the generic thing for Republicans. How has that affected or impacted your ability to relate to Republicans and also get involved within certain parts of the Republican Party that are not so welcoming to minorities or women?
That's a great question. For those of you who didn't hear the question, just want to make sure everyone heard it. No problem. So her question is to Brandon, right, to these two? Is that correct? Or for anyone? I guess for Brandon and for Ms. Martinez to address specifically, but the GOP, the Republican Party, was traditionally known as having a preponderance, let's say, of middle-aged white men making up a lot of their constituency, and she's asking for the two of them how they've been able to relate to members of the party.
Do you mind?
No, go right ahead.
Well, I think Mr. Portantino and I both touched on this a little bit before, but for me personally, when I go to vote, I kind of have a ranking of issues that matter to me most. Are there jobs being created? Is my family being burdened by too many taxes or too many regulations for their small business? Things like that. So I guess what I'm trying to say is it doesn't matter to me that Mitt Romney was white or that he was a guy. If he was a Latina woman and she represented the same values that I believe in and had the same stances on policy that matter most to me, then I would vote for her too. And so, yes, race is still a huge part of politics, and we do need to pay attention to it a lot. But if I could conclude with something, actually, I would say that the majority of Americans care about issues first, I think. I think they're smart enough to know that the color of your skin or your gender do give you perspective on certain issues, but that what you care about and your values and ideology matter more, I would say.
I've never felt unwelcomed in the Republican Party. And growing up, let me tell you the story of how I became a Republican. It goes back to 3rd grade, but I won't go that far. I'll go to my senior year in high school. My dad is a small business owner. My mom's in education. I was in special education. And one of my counselors, I was politically, I don't know how I stumbled upon this show and was Rush Limbaugh. And at the time, some of what he was a little bit of a nut, but some of what he was saying resonated with the way that I was raised. To work hard, education was important, stay active, involved, make a difference. So one of my counselors took me to see Al Gore speak at Fairfax High. And it was during that speech that I realized that everything he said contradicted my values and what I was raised to believe. So I sat back, and I was going to be 18 soon, and I thought, what is this? What really does this Democrat-Republican Party, what are their issues, what are the policies, what are their platforms? So I did my research, and I decided I was a Republican. And it was my community and realizing that I, at the time, was represented only by Democrats. And I lived in a community where, in barrios, where the high school dropout rate in 1999 was, I just dated myself, was 60%. My dad was a small business owner. At the time, regulations and taxes I saw on a daily basis that affected his ability to hire people to help in the busy season. And I realized that the policies that I heard Democrats and Republicans talking about, I aligned with Republicans. So it wasn't the color of my skin. It wasn't a particular mentor. It was realizing what was going on around me and what policy I felt as an individual would better help my community. And when I say my community, it wasn't just the Latino community, it was my community. The schools that were around me, the businesses that were around me, my family members. So I would say that I recognize while being in the party that the party has done a horrible job about including Latinos. I also understand that as a Latino, we're very, we like to be asked. I remember a couple years ago, my cousin had a party. My other cousin called me and said, Suzette, are you gonna go to Lucy's party? I was like, Lucy's having a party? Yeah, you're invited, come on, let's go. I didn't get an invitation. So here I am feeling, I didn't get invited to my cousin's party. And it's just culturally, we like to be asked. And I think that I've seen better messaging, better inclusion over the past couple of years. I've been a part of that, and I haven't experienced any obstacles that have kept me from moving forward.
Well, thank you all for a stimulating and enjoyable conversation. I'd like to ask you all to join me in thanking our panelists today, Brandon Cheung, Anthony Portantino, Chris Patterson, and of course, Suzette Martinez. Thanks to our partners at the USC Daily Trojan, specifically Isabella Sayyah, who was my co-moderator today. And a few announcements from us at the Unruh Institute. Our next Students Talk Back panel will take place 2 weeks from today. That's Wednesday, April 9th. And here, it'll be in the 227, room 227 of this building. The topic is whistleblowing, government and otherwise whistleblowing, and we have a very, very special guest joining us that day, Daniel Ellsberg, who you may know from the release of the Pentagon Papers in the 70s. He will be joining us, so please join us for that conversation. Once again, it's in 227 of this building, same time. Next Wednesday, April 2nd, we will hold our California Politics Roundtable discussion with Mr. Portantino and Mr. Strickland. Topic is California's environmental challenges and opportunities. That's in Mud Hall of Philosophy, room 102. Discussion begins at 7:30 with free food at 7:15. And finally, our scholarships award application is now available. You can find it on our website or stop by our office in BKC 263 to pick one up. The application materials are due by April 9th. We have a lot of summer scholarships for students who are seeking unpaid internships or even paid internships to help you subsidize some of the cost of living over the summer. So if you're interested in a summer internship, we encourage you to stop by our office. So thank you again for joining us today, and we'll see you in a couple weeks.
Thank you.
That's a